Bueno, muchas gracias. Es un honor
Thank you very
estar
much.
aquí,
It's an
pero,
honor for me to be here
en
today.
primer lugar, me voy a
First of all, I'd
disculparme
like to
porque
apologize
estoy enamorado de este
because
país,
I'm in love with
España.
this country. I'm in love with Spain.
Soy casado con
I'm
una
married
chica de
to
Castilla y
a
León.
girl from Castile
Muchos amigos y
León.
amigas aquí.
I have lots of good friends here.
Y tengo tres niños que hablan
And I have
español
three
mejor que
children
yo.
who speak Spanish
Pero yo
better
pienso
than
que mi
me.
español no es
But I
suficiente
believe
para
my Spanish is
dar un
not good
discurso
enough
sobre
to give a
temas
lecture on such
tan complicadas
complicated
como hoy.
topics.
Pero quizá al fin, cuando hacemos
Maybe at the end,
preguntas
during the
y
Q&A
respuestas,
session,
yo intentaré
I will try
dar
to
respuestas en
answer
español.
in
Aunque
Spanish.
si alguien me
Although,
pregunta algo sobre
if someone
Gibraltar,
asks a question
me voy
about
a dar
Gibraltar,
respuestas tan aburridos,
my
tan
answers will be so
diplomáticos, entonces
boring
lo
and
digo
so
ahora, mejor
diplomatic
no preguntar.
that you'd better not ask about Gibraltar.
It's a cliche to observe that we live in a time of unprecedented turbulence and volatility and change. The politics that I grew up with, I'm just 50 years old, the politics of the 1970s and the 1980s, in the United Kingdom at least, was a very simple political landscape. You were either from the left or the right. You either believed in high taxes or low taxes. You were either in favor of the bosses or the workers, the north, the south. And of course, at that time, before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that simple ideological landscape was underpinned by the great conflict and standoff between Soviet communism and the West. And so it was a very simple political world in which you chose one side or the other. In my country, you were either conservative or you were Labour. And you either voted the way that your mum did, your dad did, your grandparents, the people on your street, and so on. If you now look at the astonishing ideological fluidity which now exists across the developed world, that old, rigid, right-left landscape is almost entirely unrecognizable. The old debates, certainly in my country, about high taxes, low taxes, a little bit more of the market or a little bit more of the state, a little bit of the reform of the education system here or the health system there, has been replaced with a much, much more visceral distinction between those who are comfortable with the globalized order we operate in, or those who want to shut the door and close themselves off from it and protect themselves from it. And there are lots of different terms that analysts and commentators use to try and describe this new, more fluid landscape between populists and rationalists, between nativists and internationalists, between globalists and chauvinists, lots of ists and isms. But broadly speaking, we have a very profound division now in all of our societies across the developed world, certainly across Europe and in North America as well, between millions of people who feel that the status quo has betrayed them, who feel insecure, who feel frightened, and want simple solutions to very deep-seated anxieties, and those, many of whom I suspect are represented in audiences like this, who feel more comfortable with the globalized, footloose, fancy-free, liberal order in which we operate. And that distinction between those sort of two outlooks, those two perspectives, are becoming ever more polarized and are leading to new, much more turbulent distinctions in certainly the politics of my country, I suspect in the politics of this country, and is creating a challenge for the future sustainability of our political and economic and social order. And what I want to talk to you about this evening is, how is that manifesting itself in Europe? What does it mean for the future of the European Union itself? Is there a future for the European Union itself? What can we do about it? And particularly, what does it mean for my country, the United Kingdom, and for your country, Spain? And the first thing to say is that for the first time in my adult political lifetime, I think the continued existence of the European Union is possibly in question. And most certainly, if there is an election on Sunday in France in which the extreme left and the extreme right are victorious, we may, and I never thought I'd say this, we may look back on the election this Sunday, the first round of the presidential elections in France, and say that was the beginning of the end of the European Union as we know it. So the state of peril and the state of fragility for our continent and of the political institutions which we have established over the last 40, 50 years in the post-war period is very acute indeed. There are huge numbers of external pressures bearing down on our continent. We have a US president who is no friend of European integration. He might be moderating his crazy views a bit in public at the moment, but it is clear that we can no longer rely as a continent on a stable transatlantic relationship in a way that we could. And by the way, my view is that would have been the case even if Hillary Clinton had won. Not because Hillary Clinton is antagonistic to the European Union, but just strategically, it is obvious that whoever is the incumbent of the White House, America's strategic interests are increasingly focused on the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. And that begs big questions for that cement, that transatlantic glue, which underpinned the post-war settlement in our continent and across the Atlantic in the 1940s and 1950s. But there are other challenges. We now have a belligerent and aggressive incumbent in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, who tries, directly or indirectly, to do almost everything he can to subvert some of the multilateral disciplines which we have supported in the West over a very long period of time. We have in President Erdogan, after his referendum in Turkey, the re-emergence of strongman populist politics in one of our most crucial allies. So we have a lot of external pressures, and then of course internally we have suffered an acute economic and social crisis, the likes of which we have not really seen, I think, at any time in the post-war period after the financial and banking crash in 2008. I can't certainly think of any time since the Second World War where so many millions of our fellow citizens have had to endure weeks, months, year after year after year of social distress for such a long period of time. It doesn't even, or I think it is even worse, considerably worse, than the economic and social hardship of the oil crisis in the early 1970s. And I think, as I will come back to in a minute, it has very profound consequences for us. But one thing is for sure, there is now a level of public hostility and disenchantment and frustration about politics and conventional politics, which is reaching boiling point across our country, across our continent, and across the developed world. There are many reasons for this worrying development in Europe. Some of them are long-term ones, the change of patterns of work in the labor market in capitalist economies across the world, the advent of new technologies, the effect of social media. Some of them are historical. The collapse of the Berlin Wall has removed the underpinnings that stabilized the ideological debates in our hemisphere for a long period of time. The refugee crisis, the advent of extremist violence, which has instilled great fear in many, many people. But in my view, you cannot exaggerate the importance of 2008 if you want to understand what is happening to the politics of our continent now. I'd go even further than that. I think if 2008, that crashing financial crisis, the likes of which we've never experienced before, in my view, if that had not happened, I think it's most likely that Donald Trump would not have been elected President of the United States. If 2008 had not happened, I suspect very strongly that the British people would have voted to remain inside the European Union rather than leave it. I think if 2008 not happened, I don't think Geert Wilders, I don't think Beppe Grillo, I don't think Nigel Farage, I don't think the whole cast of populists and chauvinists and nationalists who are doing well in democratic contests across our continent would be as resurgent as they are. In other words, I think we are living through a period of great transition in which clearly the politics of tomorrow is going to be singularly different to the politics of yesterday. But there are many reasons propelling it, but the main reason, I think, is that we're still dealing with the social and political aftershocks of 2008. And in many ways, we're still grappling with the tectonic effects of that economic earthquake back then. So the question is, what can we do about it? And what role does Britain and Spain have as we grapple with these very profound imbalances in our own continent? Now, it might be a little unfashionable to strike an optimistic note, particularly after that somewhat pessimistic and alarmist introduction. But, and I'm sure, by the way, there is some Chinese proverb that I've forgotten that says that for every crisis offers opportunities. There is one, isn't there? Anyway, there always is. You find them on little Christmas crackers and things. But that is true. That is true. The crisis which is prevailing upon our continent presents us with a fork in the road. The European Union is now either going to rise to that challenge and revitalize itself, renew itself, reform itself, relaunch itself. In other words, embark upon a new, more positive chapter of European integration, or, as I implied earlier, most especially if the elections this Sunday in France go what I would consider to be the wrong way, it could lead in exactly the opposite direction. So we are in a sort of tipping point between disaggregation or renewal in the European Union. And I want to talk, if I may, for a minute about the positive vision of renewal rather than dwell on the possibility of collapse and disintegration. And in my view, there are, crudely speaking, three key areas where the leading politicians and leading governments, leading thinkers in the European Union need urgently to enter into a new period of reform and renewal. Because one of the things that happened after 2008, and you could see it here in this country in particular, but in my country too, is that the damage done internally to our societies and economies was so great that inevitably the political capital and energy that our governments and our leaders had, and I experienced it myself for 5 years, for half a decade, as Deputy Prime Minister of my country, were primarily inward-facing. We've gone through a phase of great political introversion as we've had to sort of turn inwards to repair the damage that has been done to the fabric of our own societies. It is essential now that even as we continue to repair the damage which we sustained in 2008, that political leaders of all persuasions and in all governments relearn the art and rediscover the ambition to do big things together on an international level. And the European Union for too long has basically turned inwards and has lost the confidence and the self-confidence to embark upon significant reform. And the three areas where I believe significant reform is now inescapable is firstly, and by far in my view, in my judgment, most importantly, is to complete the incomplete project in the Eurozone. The Eurozone is an extraordinary thing, creating a single currency of such disparate countries, such disparate economies. But it was founded on an unbalanced and incomplete basis. Firstly, let me be blunt, not least, I can say these sweeping things as a member of a country that's not part of the Eurozone, and certainly now doesn't look as if it ever will be as we leave the European Union. Clearly, it was a huge mistake with hindsight to allow political judgments to prevail about which countries should join the Eurozone in the first place. So there were countries, Greece notably, that simply were not in a position to withstand the disciplines and the monetary straitjacket that comes with a single interest rate at the outset. But secondly, a monetary union without a fiscal and wider economic union is inherently unsustainable. Of course it is. Of course it is. It is a basic rule of thumb that a single area of monetary policy needs sophisticated means by which the stresses and strains and liabilities within the kind of heterogeneous economies within that monetary union can be dealt with. Now, we all have our own monetary unions nationally. The United Kingdom is a monetary union of sort. I represent Sheffield. Sheffield is a considerably different economy to London. But we've worked out a way through the nation state of making sure that we have the shock absorbers and the flexibilities in order to deal with some of the liabilities and imbalances within that monetary union. That is absent within the Eurozone. And of course, it's in part absent for political reasons. It is extremely difficult for politicians in the creditor north, notably but not exclusively in Germany, but also in countries such as Finland, the Netherlands, Austria, and so on, to explain to the taxpayers of Germany, Finland, Austria, the Netherlands, and so on, that one way or another, they will have to foot the bill for the liabilities of countries in the debtor zone of the monetary union in southern Europe. And equally, it's extremely difficult to politically, as you know much better than I do, to persuade voters in the debtor zone of the Eurozone that they should accept punishing discipline imposed by the creditor north. So we have this north-south trade-off that is politically poisonous and economically unsustainable. So what is clearly needed, above and beyond everything else, is a new north-south pact to stabilize the Eurozone, in which, simplifying a lot of complex questions very, very dramatically, the North accepts that the taxpayers of the creditor countries in the Eurozone will, in one shape or form, have to deal with the liabilities and pay for the liabilities in other parts of the Eurozone. You can do that lots of different ways. You can write out a check. You can mutualize debt. There's lots of different ways of doing it. But at the end of the day, it all comes to the same thing. The creditor parts of the monetary union have to be prepared to put their hand in their pocket and pay out for the weaker parts of the monetary union. And conversely, the other half of the deal is clearly that the weaker parts of the monetary union accept the loss of sovereignty that is involved in the structural and economic reforms which are necessary in their own economies to make them thrive and survive within that monetary union. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. I'm not an economist. Luis Garicano can give us a long lecture about all of this in a much more sophisticated way than I ever could. But everybody knows that. Even non-economic politicians like me know that. They know it in Berlin. They know it in Brussels. It's just a question, it's a difficult question, of political will. And I hope that what becomes obvious, especially if Emmanuel Macron is elected as President of France, and perhaps most especially also if Martin Schulz is elected with a new mandate for reform as Chancellor in Germany, they could, with the crucial assistance, and I'll come back to this, of the Spanish government, they could finally muster the political will in the months to come to explain to their own peoples that for their own good and for the sustainability and prosperity of our continent, it is essential they enter into that new pact in order to complete the work, the incomplete work of the Eurozone, and to give the next younger generations of Europeans a more optimistic prospect that their own economic circumstances and job prospects will be more positive than has been the case over many years. So that is reform challenge number one. Reform challenge number two has been brought to very sharp relief by the Mediterranean migration crisis over recent months. And what that has revealed, amongst many, many other things, the terrible, heart-wrenching agony of seeing these poor refugees fleeing violence in Syria and elsewhere, the humanitarian catastrophe of people drowning in such large numbers in the Mediterranean. What it has revealed, in addition to all of that, is a fundamental design flaw, design fault in the way in which large parts of the European Union were administering our borders in recent years. And let me explain. In a crowded, chaotic continent such as ours, where you've got lots of historically drawn, higgledy-piggledy borders between countries, you can either remove those internal borders, but ensure that you have meaningful external borders, or you can keep those internal borders and remove external borders. What you can't do is what the European Union did, which is to remove all the internal borders through the creation of Schengen and not install any external border controls at the European Union either. Of course, our fellow citizens find that unacceptable. And so when they saw, on top of all the other heart-wrenching humanitarian spectacles that they were witness to in the evening news on the television every day in, day out, especially last summer at the height of the refugee crisis, what they saw as well was complete incompetence on the part of their own governments to do anything about it. Because the governments of the European Union, the Schengen area, had voluntarily given up any means by which they could control or count in people in or out of our continent. And it is not protectionist, it is not xenophobic, it is not chauvinist for people to expect that somewhere, either through internal borders or through external borders, the powers that be have some idea about who on earth is coming into our community and who on earth is leaving. We cannot expect that our fellow citizens should accept the level of administrative chaos that was revealed at our frontiers by way of the refugee crisis over the last summer. Now, steps are now being taken to implement meaningful checks at our external borders, and I cannot stress enough how important I think it is that these steps, which are now being taken belatedly, are successful. If you don't implement them successfully, I believe Schengen will eventually have to be suspended and replaced. And if you don't implement them successfully, it will be no wonder that more and more people will feel that their governments are not answering to their very basic request that there should be some meaningful administrative control about who comes in and who goes out of our continent. So that is second big reform, which I think is essential, in addition to the previous reform I've set out to the Eurozone, if we want to reinstill a sense of hope and optimism and confidence in the European project amongst the many, many millions of people who've lost faith in the European Union and in politics altogether. The third and final one is that at a time of great strategic insecurity in the way that I described earlier, unfortunately, the semi-permanent presence of extremist terrorist threats across the European continent, the behavior of the Russian government, the violence in North Africa, the instability in the Mediterranean zone itself, it seems to me essential, never mind the increasing indifference towards Europe's security needs by the new Trump administration, it seems to me essential that the European Union develops a more meaningful defense and security union and identity itself. It doesn't need to do so, in fact it shouldn't do so, in a way that contradicts or undermines NATO. But if there's one thing with which I've had some smidgen, some little whiff of sympathy with Donald Trump, it's when he says that it just cannot be right that American soldiers and American taxpayers have to continue to carry the heavy burden of guaranteeing Europe's security, whilst European governments themselves simply don't invest in their own security at sufficient levels. France and Britain are in effect the only meaningful defence powers in the European Union, and that is equally unsustainable. If the European Union wants to stand on its own two feet more, if we're going to deal with American strategic retreat from some of its long-held Atlanticist commitments, then it is absolutely essential that there is a greater collective effort on defence and security matters. Now, much of this, by the way, is not about inventing new things, it's just making sure that the money we do spend is spent in a much more coordinated fashion so that we get greater collective benefit from the national expenditures on defence so far. As a continent, right now, we spend more on defence than China and Russia combined. And yet we spend that money very poorly, we do it in a poorly coordinated way, and we do it in a wholly, and in my view, unacceptably incoherent way. And again, I don't just say this because I think it's the right policy. I think it is essential at a time of heightened insecurity that we provide a logical response to the many, many fears that our fellow citizens hold. So those are my shortlist of 3 crucial and long overdue reforms. Greater economic prosperity and optimism by way of reform of the Eurozone, greater competence and coherence in the way in which we deal with the mass movement of people in and out of our continent, and greater competence and coherence in the way in which we take our own decisions to safeguard the security and safety of our own citizens. And Spain, in my view, and I obviously say this as a non-Spaniard, but as someone who spends a lot of time here, admires your country immensely, and only wishes Spain well for the future in every single regard. Spain, in my view, can play a tremendously important role in all of these future questions as the European Union develops into the future. And there has been, how can I put it as diplomatically as I can, an almost excessive modesty and humility in the way in which Spain has refrained from playing a more overt and self-confident role in European Union affairs in recent years. It's possibly because of the huge efforts that have had to that have been entered into to deal with the consequences of the economic crisis here in Spain that has quite understandably preoccupied all governments and all politicians of all persuasions in Spain in recent years. But I do think that now is the time for Spain to lift its eyes beyond its own national horizons and seek to extend its own influence more forcefully and self-confidently beyond its own borders. I so happen to think that that is not only just a choice, it is a duty at a time when the United Kingdom, in my view, tragically and erroneously, is retreating from its European vocation and is almost inevitably headed towards a diminution in its global role. And I'll come back in a minute to the British debate about Brexit and so on. But it seems to me that whatever the outcome of the Brexit negotiations, it is abundantly clear that the United Kingdom will not play the pivotal leadership role that it has sought to play on defence, on economic reform, on the enlargement of the European Union, of the creation of the single market, of the Atlanticism that it has always espoused as America's closest ally. Clearly all of those things are now either going to be abandoned altogether by the United Kingdom or certainly weakened significantly. And I think Spain could play a tremendously important role in stepping into that strategic vacuum that in many ways will be left by the United Kingdom's departure to uphold some of the positive aspects of that small L liberal, dare I call it, Anglo-Saxon legacy, which otherwise is not going to be promoted by London in the future. And the reasons why I think Spain is well placed to do so is that, of course, I'm aware that there are always political scandals and ructions and controversies in Spain as much as there are in many other places. But Spain does have a certain political stability nonetheless, which is quite different to that which you see in many other European countries. Because hitherto, and I want to pay my own personal tribute to Albert Rivera and so much of what he stands for, but also politicians of other parties, Spain, I think, has been remarkably immune so far from the right-wing xenophobic nationalism that has engulfed politics in one member state after the next. You see it in my own country. You see it in Spain. You see it in the Netherlands. You see it in the populism, perhaps slightly differently, of Pepe Grillo in Italy. You see it in the chauvinism of populist movements in Scandinavia. In country after country after country, the economic crisis that we have withstood and the wider forces that I've described to you have propelled millions of voters to seek simple solutions from nationalist, protectionist, isolationist, right-wing populists. And Spain, by accident or by design, has so far at least avoided that fate. And that puts, I think, Spain in a very commanding position politically, because the consensus, broadly speaking, in Spain has been maintained that Spain should retain its European identity and should not turn its back on the outside world. And that being the case, that is a considerably powerful political asset, which I think Spain could deploy with greater self-confidence on the European stage. Of course, as I said earlier, I'm acutely aware that there are raging debates about corruption in Spanish politics and the future fate of Catalonia in or out of Spain. Sure, but those are debates for you and for the Spanish political classes. But for those of us outside Spain who care passionately about the future of our continent, it is essential, it seems to me, that Spain participates in some of these big debates about the future reforms of the European Union more fully than it has done hitherto. And I think its relative immunity from those false, xenophobic simplicities puts it in a strong position to do so. Secondly, there is, in Spain at least, a credibility which comes with the experience of having gone through all these very painful adjustments, these very painful reforms in the wake of the economic crisis, which in my view places Spain and possibly Ireland in a unique category of your own, as countries that, maybe imperfectly, maybe it is still incomplete, but nonetheless a country which has been through a very, very dark chapter economically and socially and is starting to grow sustainably again. Spain can say with real feeling and credibility, we took the medicine. We entered into some of these painful adjustments. We accepted that some of the excesses of the past were a huge mistake. We have made adjustments. We have entered into far-reaching reforms, and we are now starting to grow at a more sustainable rate in the future. That gives Spain, unlike other Mediterranean countries such as Greece, for instance, and others, unique credibility, it seems to me, when or if Presidents Macron and Schulz are discussing their plans for a stabilization and a rebalancing of the Eurozone. It gives Spain, it seems to me, unique credibility to say we have a voice in this debate about how the Eurozone should be reformed in the future. And third and finally, and this is much more obvious to you than it is to me, Spain is, of course, Europe's pivot towards the Hispanic world, and most especially to that huge and strategically important hemisphere of Latin America, which is entirely unique to Spain, and again is a strategic asset, which it seems to me Spain could deploy to greater and more self-confident effect than has been the case so far. And so I guess it might seem odd to you, as a non-Spaniard, to say this, but I very much hope that in the context of all of the wider forces that I've described to you, I very much hope that Spain will, in the months and years to come, be increasingly a co-architect and a co-author of the next chapter of European politics, the next chapter of European integration, in a way that my country once was, and alas will never be again, but which I think it is essential, not only for Spain's future, but for Europe's future, that you should play that role. Can I end, because it would be odd not to do so, just saying a few words about the general election that Theresa May has called this week. and the wider dilemma facing the United Kingdom as we seek to extricate ourselves from the European Union. I mean, the first thing to say is that Theresa May has given rather various terribly grand, dignified-sounding reasons why she's holding this general election, because she wants to strengthen her hand in the Brexit negotiations. The truth, of course, as is so often the case, is that she is triggering this general election for nothing other than pretty grubby, tactical, and rather cynical and opportunistic political reasons. Firstly, her principal opponent, the leader of the British Labour Party, is one of the most unelectable leaders of the opposition in British politics that I've ever encountered in my adult political lifetime. There is simply no remote possibility that the British people will ever put Jeremy Corbyn into number 10 as the Prime Minister of our great country, and she knows that, and she wants to take advantage of that. And secondly, she knows that the utopianism that has surrounded the promise of Brexit in British politics. You will have read the promises from Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and Michael Gove that the moment we leave the European Union, the sun will shine, Spanish style, forever. There will be no traffic jams. We will get hundreds of millions of pounds for the NHS. Immigration will no longer be a problem. Jobs will grow on trees. Money will suddenly fructify in your pockets. I mean, this is ludicrous, ludicrous, if highly effective utopianism that was promised to the British people. She knows that the gap between that what has been promised on Brexit, and the much, much more difficult reality of Brexit, which will become quite apparent over the next 2 or 3 years, will make life for her very, very difficult politically. So she has, perhaps quite logically from her point of view, if somewhat cynically, decided to get her excuses, and indeed her elections, in early before the bad Brexit news hits. So that is the reason why we're having this election. I think, and I announced yesterday morning that, contrary, I have to say, to my own expectations, I thought the last general election was my last political election ever, but there you go, you get sucked back into politics from time to time. I am standing again in my own constituency in Sheffield, and I'm flying directly there again tomorrow morning. And one of the reasons that I have decided, after 12 years of various ups and downs in British politics since I was first elected to the House of Commons, to do so, is because I actually don't think there's much question about who's going to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think, unless something very dramatic happens, Theresa May will be Prime Minister on June the 9th. The question is, what mandate has she got? What majority has she got? And crucially, who is going to oppose her? Who is going to oppose the dogmatic, uncompromising, damaging and self-harming version of Brexit, which she has chosen as the future aim of her government? Who is going to oppose her? And that is why it is tremendously important, in my view, that notwithstanding the fact that I think it is pretty inevitable, never certain, nothing is certain in politics, certainly not these days, but pretty inevitable that she will continue to be Prime Minister, it is essential for the future of the United Kingdom that she is not given a landslide victory to basically ignore everybody and ignore all forms of opposition for the next half a decade and impose on the British people a Brexit, which I should stress, no one voted for last year. Even people who voted Brexit didn't necessarily vote to quit the single market as well, and to quit the customs union, to quit every single aspect of European affiliation. Yet she has chosen, because of pressure from the right wing in her own party, to pursue the most uncompromising, the most abrupt, the most brutal rupture with European Union that is possible. And I think that is a travesty of democracy, because I don't think that is a fair reflection of the very finely balanced referendum result that occurred last year. It is also, in my view, a form of generational theft, because 70% of youngsters between the ages of 18 and 24 who voted in the referendum last year, 70% voted for a quite different future. And it is quite a thing in a mature democracy for the Prime Minister of the day to say to millions of young people, you voted for a different future, I don't care. You want a different future, I'm not going to listen to you. And now I'm going to impose upon you, the very people who will have to live with the consequences of a hard Brexit, the most unattractive and unappealing and damaging version of Brexit on your young shoulders. And I think it is essential that there are more Liberal Democrat MPs, that there are courageous pro-European Labour MPs, that there are courageous pro-European Conservative MPs who are returned on June the 9th to oppose that vision of such damaging rupture from the European Union. And here's the crucial bit: retain the freedom and the discretion to vote against the Brexit deal, which is finally presented to the British Parliament in the next couple of years by Theresa May. So in many respects, all I can say to you on day 2 of this phony election campaign, which hasn't quite got going yet, is that what is at stake is not really who's going to be in number 10 or not. It's what kind of majority she's going to get, what kind of mandate she's going to get, and crucially, who and how will she be effectively opposed after June the 8th to prevent her from imposing on Britain a fate which I believe will be very damaging to the future of the country that I love as much as I do. And in many ways, the result will have a profound impact. So, for instance, if her majority is not as great as she clearly hopes, that will have a profound impact on the courage and the self-confidence of Parliament and of MPs in Parliament in 2 years' time to do what I think they should do, which is to put country before party and to put their own conscience before their own political affiliation when they come to decide on that fateful day in 2 years' time whether they are really going to give consent to the Brexit, which will be put before them at that time. So, to put it mildly, we meet this evening at a time of unprecedented turbulence, anxiety, and volatility in the politics of our extraordinary, beautiful, but anguished European continent. And much as I carry a very heavy and sad heart about the developments in my own country, I'm tremendously optimistic by what I see is possible from a renewed confidence in Spain about its own future and its own ability to help shape a brighter future for our children and our grandchildren across Europe. Thank you very much for listening to me.